We're going to finish up talking about the eye. Well, actually, we're going to still talk about some of the neural processing that's occurring within the eye, but at this point, we were finishing up with the properties of the photoreceptors themselves. So those sensory receptors that are doing the transduction of electromagnetic information into electrochemical information that the brain can understand. And so we've gone through this summary review a couple times at the beginning and at the end of the last video. The photoreceptors are rods and cones, and they differ from each other in their physical appearance, their distribution, their wiring to the brain, the clinical issues that we can see with them, and then also in their functional significance. And we'd gone through all of that, except we were halfway through really the functional significance. We'd talked about dark adaptation and how the cones regenerate more quickly they regenerate more quickly, so they are getting to their maximal sensitivity more quickly in the dark, but we get better ability to see dim light and in dim light with our rods, and the rods take longer to regenerate. So for us to really regenerate as many of our rods as we possibly can so that we can see very well at night or in the dark, it takes really about somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes, really. So another aspect of the functional significance of what the rods and cones are doing for us functionally that is different from each other is that the cones are really giving us our color vision. And we're going to start this by showing these spectral sensitivity curves where we're looking at relative sensitivity, and we can see that our rods are at their most sensitive, so they absorbed best the about wavelengths of light at about 500 nanometers. It's really about 510 nanometers. The cones, on average, they absorb light the best at about 580 nanometers. I'm going to go through this idea of the spectral sensitivity curve that I just showed you, and actually a reproduction of that curve is in the bottom of this image in B, where we're showing more sensitivity as being higher up on the graph. But remember, what happens is how we do this is we measure a person's threshold. What is the least amount of stimulus energy required for them to say, yes, I see that stimulus? And so the top curve in A is mostly probably what I'll talk about from here, which is the measure of threshold. So when it's lower, our sensitivity is higher. And the way they measure this is for colors, different colors of light or different wavelengths of light, is to use a monochromatic light to determine threshold at different wavelengths. If you remember me saying that it's the wavelength from peak to peak of the light information that tells us hue or color, and that we usually don't see those perfect sine waves, so sinusoidal waveforms, in the real world. We can see them refracted, the sunlight refracted through water or through a prism. Those rainbows are truly made up of pure wavelengths or waveforms, and but they have created these monochromatic lights. So these are pure waveforms at a particular wavelength. They can present those to the people, and what we see for our cones is that we have this really low threshold, about 580 nanometers. Our cones are, so this is really averaged across the cones, are responding to other wavelengths of light. They're just not as sensitive to those wavelengths of light. And of course, 1 over threshold is our sensitivity, and that's how we get those spectral sensitivity curves that I showed in the previous slide, and that's being shown here in B. So I'm going back to showing spectral sensitivity curves. So when sensitivity is higher, it's higher up on the figure. And actually, these are absorption spectra. So what is the relative proportion of light that is being absorbed for rods and for the 3 types of cones. So before we kind of smashed all the cones together to say that yes, they're giving us a different part of the electromagnetic spectrum that they are the most sensitive to, but really that was averaging across the 3 kinds of cones. If we look at the figure, the R is marking what's going on with the rods, that they are right around, I want to say 500, 510 nanometers. The short wavelength cones, they absorb best at about 419 nanometers. And so again, you can see that it's not quite a normal curve, but it's kind of a normal curve where I absorb best at 419 nanometers, but I'm still absorbing some of the wavelengths of light. I just do a little bit worse and worse and worse as we move away from that 419 nanometers. For the medium wavelength cones, they absorb best at 530 nanometers, and the long wavelength cones absorb best at about 560, 558 nanometers. And since there are more medium and long wavelength cones, that's why that average ends up being up towards the about 558. I think some people say 560, but I don't see where they get that average, because that's slightly above the long wavelength cones. But regardless of our exact averages, and you don't need to know the exact numbers, just that there are short wavelength cones that are absorbing best at the short end of that spectrum, the shorter wavelengths, medium wavelength cones, and long wavelength cones. And I'm going to talk about that as giving us color vision here, and that being significant to the functionality of what the cones are giving us. They are what are giving us color vision. But I'm going to talk about that in much more detail when we talk about color vision towards the end of the semester. So I think this is the 4th time I'm putting up the summary slide. You really should just look it over now and say to yourself, do I understand the differences between the rods and the cones in these various aspects of how they look, where they are on the retina, their wiring, the clinical issues, and their functional significance?